Hello, everyone. We are live once more. We are streaming this to LinkedIn. We are streaming this to YouTube, and it will also become available on my podcast. And today I'm very pleased to say I'm joined by Rhian Lewis. Hi, Rihann.
Hi.
It's so nice to have you with us. You have just published a book called The Cryptocurrency Revolution. And so how has your book launch gone? I think was it yesterday or the day before?
It was the weekend.
The week.
So I've had lots of people asking questions about it. I think it's a topic that a lot of people are interested in, but maybe don't know much about. So it's been quite interesting that as I've been talking about the book launch, I've just had a lot of people asking, so what's all this about? And so on. But I'm hugely excited about it, of course.
Very good. So today's topic is obviously cryptocurrency. We will talk about all the different cryptocurrencies around. We'll hopefully demystify a lot of those misconceptions people might have about cryptocurrencies and digital currencies. And we will hopefully touch on other things like Facebook's Libra. We will talk about digital currencies that have been issued by countries. We'll talk about tokens. And hopefully people will come away with this with a really good understanding of the topic. So you split your time between being a software developer and working on blockchain projects. How did you get into this?
Well, years and years and years ago, my first degree was BSc in economics. So I've always been hugely interested in financial systems and how money works. And when Bitcoin came along, I just became really fascinated by it. And back in 2013, which was obviously a couple of years after Bitcoin first launched, I stepped up my interest in it, started reading absolutely everything I could get my hands on, and I decided to build a little cryptocurrency portfolio tracker to help people keep track of their cryptocurrencies. And from then on, I just went down a complete rabbit hole of becoming obsessed with this stuff, talking to people in the space. I started a meetup group, founded a couple of startups, started working a little bit on the technical side, trying to figure out how some of this stuff worked, especially Ethereum. And all the time I just kept thinking, this is so interesting. It's such an interesting story. I really want to tell more people about this.
Mhm.
So I decided to write a book. And I can't quite believe, however many years on, that it's finally published.
Well done. Congratulations. It's such a great feeling, isn't it?
It really is.
So why do you think cryptocurrency and this whole topic around digital currencies matters today? Why is it important? There's so much confusion around why is it important and why should anyone care?
I think everybody should know about this stuff simply because it's becoming mainstream to the extent that even if you don't go out, for example, and buy Bitcoin, you're highly likely in the next few years, probably sooner than people realize, to be using some variety of digital currency, whether or not that's something like Facebook's currency, which we'll talk about later, or the different bank digital currencies. Now, a lot of people might look at this and think, what's she talking about? I already use digital currency. I use my debit card, or I use Apple Pay or Google Pay. But that's not quite the same thing as the virtual currencies that we're talking about. I think people don't often think that deeply about what money is. We just assume that it's something that governments create and that we use via a bank, whether that's a bank app and so on. Whereas in fact, this is a relatively recent idea. Money can be anything you want it to be. And these new digital currencies are what we're going to be using in our increasingly digital future. So it's very important that people understand what they're using and the implications of them.
Absolutely. So we'll get all into this in a minute. I'm just having little looks through the stream here, and we have literally people, as always, joining in from all over the world. We have Anna Maria saying hello here from Spain. We have Raul from Malaysia. We have, let me just have a look. We've got France from Austria. And we've got Franca from New York in America. We've got Sanjo from Nigeria. We have Lena from Tanzania. Muhammad from Bahrain. We've got someone from Pakistan, from Vietnam, from Uruguay, from the United Arab Emirates. So it's really lovely to see everyone here. Marcelo from Brazil. Really good to have everyone on board. And as I always say, these sessions are for everyone who is joining us on these. So if you have any specific questions or any comments, put them into the stream and let us know what you want to know and what you want us to discuss. I guess when people think about cryptocurrencies, they very often think about Bitcoin. And sometimes there's a bit of confusion. What's the difference between Bitcoin and blockchain, and are they the same thing? This is a topic I spend quite a lot of time writing about, trying to demystify this. But what's your take on this? How would you explain the difference between Bitcoin and blockchain?
Bitcoin is a currency, a way of storing value and transferring that value. So paying out value and holding value. Blockchain technology is simply the type of IT architecture, if you want, that enables Bitcoin to exist. So you can think of it in terms of having a pound or a dollar or any of the many different national currencies that all these people from all over the world who have been commenting belong to. And then you can think of the system that underpins these national currencies and allows them to exist. So a blockchain is simply a way of organizing data that means that you can issue tokens or currencies on top of it, or sometimes not even that, enable different applications to run. So you can think of it, if you like, as simply a way of storing information. And the reason why a blockchain or a blockchain type ledger is so different from any of the systems that we had before is that people who don't know each other are able to make transactions with each other and interact with each other without knowing who the other people are, because the way the data is stored and structured means that it is very, very difficult for people to alter that information once it's been written into the data structure. And also, because it exists in many different places at once, everybody is seeing the same information in different places. So we can think of that, for example, if you're a traditional bank and you hold all your records in databases where only the bank's employees have access to them. That's an entirely different thing from having this information stored in places, in many different places all around the world. In the case of Bitcoin, anybody can download the software and run the software and see all the transactions that are happening. That's not necessarily the case for all blockchains, but the idea of having a blockchain which is a decentralized data structure like this means that it's very transparent, so everybody can see the transactions, and at the same time the transactions are stored in a way that it's more or less impossible for people to reverse those transactions or alter them in some way. So a traditional bank, for example, you could think of all the security as being around the outside of the data and people having to be responsible for hiding the data away and making sure people can't access it. With a blockchain, it's different. The security is built into the structure of the data itself. So you don't need all the extra stuff around the outside to keep it safe.
Very good. And what are the key things that make Bitcoin different from traditional money?
The one thing I think that makes Bitcoin very different is that it's not run by a person or an organization or a country. It is effectively uncensorable money. And this is very important because people think, why do people need a form of money that is uncensorable? And they start thinking about things that sound bad, like maybe things people don't want people to buy. But it's very important from a political point of view, because if you live in a country where the government perhaps doesn't allow people to buy things like subscriptions to political parties or certain books or certain publications, or they restrict in that way what people can spend their money on, it's very important for people to be able to have a way of sending money to each other, which cannot be interfered with like this. And it's also very important because, as we know with national currencies, the we tend to think of them as being very, very stable, but in fact they're not always stable. And in countries where Bitcoin has become very popular, some of these countries are places where there's been a lot of inflation, where the value of the national currency loses its value over time, and people prefer to put their wealth somewhere, or put some of their wealth, because I would never advise people to go out and buy Bitcoin, because it's very much, it's one of those things you always say to people, always invest only what you can afford to lose. But people are increasingly starting to see decentralized, uncensorable currencies like Bitcoin as
Mm.
a safer bet than in some countries where inflation means that the purchasing power of the national currency might get eroded. The fact that there's no central person deciding how many Bitcoins can be released, or the fact that it's governed by a mathematical formula makes it it means that it can't be corrupted or influenced by people, by political parties, and so on. I think that's quite an important thing for people to understand.
Very good. And just putting in George's comment, he's saying very well explained. So
Oh,
thank you very
that's
much.
nice.
Um, okay, that was very useful. But I guess what's added to the complication of this whole picture is we now understand what Bitcoin is, we understand how it's different from blockchain, but then there are so many other alternative cryptocurrencies and altcoins like Ethereum, like Litecoin. Maybe you can give us a little overview of some of the main ones, and mainly how are they different from Bitcoin, and do they use blockchain in the same way? Basically, how do they differ from what we've just spoken about?
Okay, so there are literally thousands and thousands and thousands of different cryptocurrencies, and that's not an exaggeration. If you go to one of the sites where they're all listed, you'll see 3, 4, maybe 5,000 different coins. A lot of those can be simply discounted because they were created simply for people to, I wouldn't go as far as saying to scam money, but they were created in order for people to make money and maybe make people think they did a little bit more than they did. But one of the more interesting projects is Ethereum, which I think is probably, as you say, the one of the main cryptocurrencies that people think of other than Bitcoin. Um, the thing that Ethereum allows people to do, which is, I wouldn't say unique, because other blockchains also allow this to happen. They allow for what we call smart contracts to run. Now, a smart contract is very badly named because it's not smart, and it's not actually a contract because code is not yet law. So what do we mean by a smart contract? We mean that on the many different computers all around the world that run Ethereum, because like Bitcoin, Ethereum is an open source software which anyone can download, you can actually run small pieces of code which can work like, if person A does that, then person B has to pay person C this. So they are small chunks of computer code which are executed on many different computers at the same time. And this is interesting because the fact that it exists in many places at once means that it's not like one person running some code on a computer that you can't trust. You can look at the code, see it being executed in all kinds of places. So the interesting thing about this is that it opens up the possibility of having things like different financial products, different legal agreements executed automatically without having to have a whole load of people signing them off. We're not really going to have time, I think, during this hour to veer too much into the topic of having private blockchains that don't have currencies. It's sort of outside the scope of this.
Yeah.
But just to give people the idea that this idea of having shared computer networks with little pieces of code that can execute agreements and everybody can see the agreements being executed is the basis for a whole lot of advances in things like proving that supply chains are being run correctly, that products are what they say they are, that kind of thing. We haven't got time to go into that. But Ethereum allows for a purely decentralized way of making payments in response to other circumstances. Like, for example, you might have person A saying, I will issue a futures contract, or I will issue a spread bet that says the price of oil will be this on this date. And if the price of oil is this in this date, you don't need to have two companies arranging the settlement between them and somebody hitting a button or code running on some company's computer. That contract will execute automatically in a way that everybody can see it. So Ethereum is really interesting from that point of view. Obviously, I could go into many of the top 10 different cryptocurrencies. They've all got their own particular advantages and disadvantages. But I think what people have to remember is that it's following a kind of template that started with Bitcoin, and everything from that is people seeing if they can take it a little bit further or do something different. But it all comes down to the same basic principles that Bitcoin operates under.
Very good. Fascinating. So I guess we can't really talk about digital currencies without talking about Libra, Facebook's attempt to launch a cryptocurrency. Lots of confusion, lots of hype. I think companies pulling in and out of being part of the consortium. So, what's your take on Libra at the moment, where we are, and on the latest developments around Libra?
Okay, so again, I think this is such a fascinating story. Because even people in very senior positions in politics and so on, don't think so much about what money is, or maybe they don't think so much about technology. It seemed to take a lot of people by surprise. And this whole narrative is so interesting. So for people who might be listening to this that don't know so much about the Libra project, it was designed by Facebook with the help of many different partners in a consortium, as you say, to allow for digital payments through Facebook's products like Facebook and WhatsApp. So a lot of the problems that we have with payments at the moment are friction. If you want to send a couple of dollars from country A to country B, that's often not possible because it would be eaten up in fees and take days to arrive. So one of the great things about Bitcoin was that it allowed more or less instantaneous payments, or payments within 10 minutes with very, very low fees. Between countries where people maybe didn't have a bank account, or if they had a bank account, it would take maybe 5 days to reach their account and then have a whole load of fees attached. Bitcoin really was the first currency that enabled payments to be made that weren't like that. And Facebook envisages a similar thing. Where, say, you have a phone and you have WhatsApp or you have Facebook, that you wouldn't necessarily need a bank account. You would have a blockchain-enabled currency, where instead the main difference between something like Libra and Bitcoin is that Facebook and its partners would control the computers on which these transactions run. So they would share those. It wouldn't be a public network that anyone could join. And Facebook envisaged that they would have this entirely independent currency, not linked to any state currencies. So you could be on Facebook and you could say, I want to pay my friend, I'm in Indonesia, I want to pay my friend who lives in Switzerland, I need to send them
Okay, it looks like we have lost Rihann. Hopefully she will be dialing in again. Let me just send her a quick email. I'm really sorry about this. If anyone has any more questions about cryptocurrencies, as always, just let me know. Put them into the stream. This is going fantastically well. If we can't get Rihann back now, we will schedule the following, the rest of the conversation for another day. Okay, let me just say, it's so nice, as I said, to see so many of you on the stream. I think Rihann is back. Here we are.
I'm so sorry about that. I don't know if it was my end or not. I just suddenly lost you, and I'm not sure. What was the last thing people heard me talking about?
So let me just. So you were talking about the Facebook Libra journey, and that they were thinking they could have a completely independent currency from state-controlled currencies.
Yes. So the idea was that if you had WhatsApp or Facebook, you could make a payment without going through a bank, directly through the app. For very little money and more or less straight away. So none of that waiting for payments to clear. We have that to a limited extent with PayPal, but obviously with PayPal, you need things like bank accounts, debit cards, and so on. This was an attempt to divorce the idea of having something that's denominated in dollars or euros or whatever, and have something that was purely an app-to-app transfer of value. Now, the controversial thing was that although in the past private currencies issued by companies have been very common and very popular, it's not something we're used to in the 20th century. So a lot of politicians were very upset by this. And obviously, one of the reasons they were upset was that the original vision for Libra was that it would be tied to a basket of currencies. So it wouldn't be like one Libra would be worth $1. It was it would be a Libra would be worth an average balance of a whole load of different currencies, and that balance would be decided by, if you like, a monetary committee, like the sort of monetary committees that central banks have. So if you imagine that you're in a country where maybe the currency isn't doing so well, it could be very imbalancing, because people might see, oh, I'll put my money into Libra, and that way I'm protecting the value of my savings or whatever. So it's very threatening, obviously. So after hearings in Congress and so on, because even though it was broadly an American project to start with, the American regulatory authorities were not very happy with this. And it's now been reworked slightly so that a Libra would, in each country, would represent the value of the currency in that country. Although intriguingly, they've hinted again recently that they might think about moving towards the basket of currencies. So they're talking to regulators at the moment. In the EU, the regulators made a statement about Libra again a few weeks ago. So it's all going through the processes at the moment. But I think while I don't think that it's like Bitcoin in the sense that it's an independent entity because people will decide its value, I think it's a really amazing development because it's making people talk about what currencies are, and it's broadening the debate about what money is actually going to look like in the future and how we'll use it. So I think it's a really interesting narrative, and I just wish as I'm sure you know, the thing about writing a book is that the situation at the time it goes to print is set in stone, whereas this is an evolving story, and I hope very much to keep writing about it in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, it's fascinating that with other cryptocurrencies, they have always been they've almost been in the dark for some of the political organizations and for politicians and for some of the big financial institutions. And suddenly when you have a player like Facebook saying we are launching this, and suddenly everyone in the world has access to it with billions of users, suddenly the awareness levels go up and you start having those discussions. So I think it's really important to have those discussions. And it's fascinating to watch this project unfold.
It really is, yeah.
Yeah, and talking about the role of governments then and politics and all of this, there are also countries that are issuing digital currencies. Do you want to give us an overview of some of those projects and what they're aiming to do?
Yes. Now, this, I think, it is a positive development in some ways because it will enable people who don't have bank accounts to transact digitally. I'll come back to that in a minute. But it's a negative in very many ways as well because of what we talk about as the programmable nature of these new currencies. So just to unpack some of these terms for a minute. I think the main project that we'll look at is China because they have been developing their own digital currency for several years now, and it is actually rolled out in China in 4 pilot areas at the moment with digital wallet in people's hands. Almost every other country in the world is developing digital currencies. Whether or not all of them will go ahead, we don't know. It might be that some countries will find different ways of launching digital products that are not blockchain based. But one of the main things we have to understand about these digital currencies is that instead of having a bank account with your bank, you will effectively be transacting directly through the central bank. So, for example, I'm based in the UK. Say I have an account with Barclays or HSBC. If there was a British digital currency and I wanted to pay my mother or pay my friend, or pay for something in a shop, I would do it through the Bank of England. I would not do it through Barclays. So the banks will still exist, but they will become service providers who aren't necessarily dealing with the settlement part of these digital payments. It's important because at the moment the banks wield a lot of power over who can and can't make digital payments. We all know with the pandemic, it's hastened trends which were here already, in that lots of places now are not accepting cash. And also, if you want to buy anything online or transact online, cash is no good. So that effectively was disenfranchising a lot of people who couldn't make digital payments because they were not profitable enough for the banks to want them as a customer. So it's positive from that point of view because it will enable, it's putting a digital phone wallet in the hands of people who don't have bank accounts and allowing them to spend money directly through their central bank. However, the negatives are massive because when I talked a little bit about smart contracts in terms of Ethereum, these digital payments are not just like using your debit card online where you pay however many pounds or dollars, euros, whatever currency for a product. These programmable transactions might allow the central bank to issue you with a tax rebate or a social security allowance, a welfare benefit that could only be spent on particular things. Or it would allow people to, it would be able to influence people. So, for example, if we look at Japan, which, as any economist will tell you, has had a problem over the years with deflation, with encouraging people to go out and spend money to kickstart the economy. They've tried various things like giving people tax rebates, but people have just ended up quite understandably saving the money because they are anxious about not having money in the future. So having a central bank digital currency could, and I'm not saying it necessarily would, because a lot of central banks might not want to do that, but it opens up the possibility that it would allow governments to issue currencies in a way that could only be spent on particular things. And that has the potential ultimately to be quite dystopian because without some kind of privacy protection built in, not only can the central bank gather data on who you are, what you're spending your money on. Obviously, having anonymized data and aggregating it is really awesome because it can allow you to do things that help people and put in place helpful policies. But having that data available on a micro level of this person is spending money buying too much cake or too much beer, let's give them a wallet, which means they can't buy cake or they can't buy beer and they can only buy fresh vegetables. You know, governments, they obviously tend to operate on the basis that they know what's best for us, and often it's done with the best intentions. But do we really want to surrender all our freedoms in that way? So I think they're positive in lots of ways, but used in an inappropriate way, they can be perhaps slightly negative.
Very good. I'm just having a look through my stream here and through some of the questions, and lots of questions, lots of people asking about that when they first heard about Bitcoin, that is related to scamming. People believe that this is used on the dark web. People buy criminal things for it. So what is the link between digital currencies and the criminal activity and the scamming part?
It's interesting because it's always the first thing that people think of. Whereas in fact, I wish I had this statistic to hand, but the proportion of physical US dollars that are used for criminal activity and the proportion of Bitcoin is hugely the reverse of what people would expect it to be.
Very interesting.
Bitcoin is still quite an unpopular tool for people wishing to engage in organized crime. And one of the reasons for this is that while it is thought of as an anonymous way to make payments, it is actually what we call pseudonymous. Payments that go through the Bitcoin blockchain, while they are not linked to a bank account with a name on it, blockchain forensics mean that these transactions can actually be traced quite easily through the Bitcoin blockchain. And for criminals who want an easy exit into cash, it's not so easy, because at some point you are going to have to make a real world transaction, whether that's for cash or for a house or a boat or whatever, and it can be quite easy to be tracked down. So a lot of people don't use Bitcoin for these reasons. And the other thing that we have to remember is that, going back to what I talked about right at the beginning about politics, is that yes, there are some things that are negative or criminal, but then there are other things in certain countries that might not be legal, that in other countries are legal. And for example, buying a political book or something like that. And I feel that it is quite important to have this ability to be able to spend uncensorable money on something like that. And I think it's a shame that the debate always gets focused on things like, but it's used for drugs and guns, when that is actually such a tiny percentage of its usage. As far as scams go, this is a real danger area. But one of the things that I always say is the only weapon against being scammed is to educate yourself. Because if you use Bitcoin correctly as it was designed to be used, you are not handing over huge sums of money to an individual to invest in Bitcoin for you. That is the worst thing that you can do. Although some banks now, especially in America, are now allowed to apply for licenses to hold people's cryptocurrencies for them. People shouldn't really be in a position where they are handing their money to person X or company Y to buy Bitcoin for them. And that, in fact, is where most of the scams have occurred. If you're using Bitcoin yourself and you educate yourself about the processes of how to use it, you won't get scammed. You might, however, end up losing money because the value can fluctuate. And that's why I would never say to anyone on this stream, or to anyone I come into contact with, you should really buy Bitcoin. I don't think it's appropriate for people to say, buy Bitcoin. There is an acronym, DYOR, do your own research, which people use a lot in the cryptocurrency world. I think that's really important. What I'm trying to do with the book is not say to people, you should go out and buy cryptocurrencies, but I'm trying to say you should take an interest in this, use this book as a springboard for going and finding out more and educating yourself, because it's really interesting and really important. And if you do your own research, you won't get scammed.
Very good point. And I think the implications of cryptocurrencies are not just for all of us and how we pay for things and where we put our savings, but also for every business that accept transactions, that makes payments, that receives payments, as well as any financial services institution. So huge implications for all of this. Again, quite a few people asking about tokens. This is another thing that we hear when we talk about digital currencies, cryptocurrencies. So maybe you can give us a little overview of how tokens are potentially revolutionizing the financial services industry, and maybe give us some examples of tokens and what they are to again illustrate this. And I think one person was asking in the stream, can tokens be legally seen as assets, for example? So maybe you can give us a little overview of tokens.
Okay, so the easiest example of a token is Bitcoin itself. So we don't tend to think of, we're so used to thinking of it as a coin because it has coin in the name. But in fact, all it is a type of token that represents a certain unit of value. When you have a decentralized blockchain, a blockchain which anyone can join, the people who validate the transactions are called miners. And in fact, that's a kind of exciting sounding name, but they're really accountants. But that doesn't sound so exciting, so we call them miners, not accountants. And a token is simply a unit of value which is generated as a thank you or a reward for people buying the equipment and using the electricity that keeps these networks running. Or it might be awarded to people who take part in the network in other ways. For example, on Reddit, there are a couple of subreddits where you can earn tokens for your participation and your engagement as a valued community member. A token is really just a unit of value that because of its scarcity or its desirability can be converted into other units of value, whether that's fiat currencies or other tokens. And one of the very interesting uses of tokens we see at the moment is in the decentralized finance or DeFi world. I don't think I'm going to have time to talk really extensively about DeFi, but it's quite a good example of tokens, so bear with me. So decentralized finance is simply a way of creating the existing world of financial instruments like futures and derivatives and so on, but based on decentralized blockchains so that you don't have to be a qualified investor to invest in these. And I'll say here, very, very risky, because they are very risky. You can lose everything if you don't know what you're doing. Products. This is distinct from something like Bitcoin. These are structures built on top of blockchains, which can get very complicated. So tokens might be used here, for example, if you have a group of people who want to pool their assets into an exchange where people can buy and sell. Those people might get rewarded with tokens for being part of what's called this liquidity pool. And they might be rewarded by tokens, which are called governance tokens in this instance, for voting. So that's one example of tokens. Moving right out of the realm of financial instruments and so on, we can see other use cases, like, for example, there's a consortium of automotive and transport people working on ideas for mobility tokens, where you might be paid in tokens for using your car at an off-peak time, or for walking instead of driving and things like that. So this is all moving away from the way that we traditionally think of money as being something that we have in a physical wallet or physical purse or a bank account. And its tokens are a way that we can effectively financialize almost every aspect of our life. They're complicated concepts, but it's the kind of thing that if you talked about the internet 20 years ago, most people would have thought that was a fairly complicated concept, yet everybody just accepts it as a part of normal life. In 20 more years, we'll be using tokens for all kinds of different things, even if we don't realize that we're using them.
Very good. So do you think we're at a point now where cryptocurrencies are going mainstream? And what do you see as the biggest challenges for cryptocurrencies to overcome, to become more widely accepted?
I think there are various challenges. Some of those are technical and infrastructure challenges. I could see back in the comments, sorry, I can't remember who it was who asked, but at least one person asked a great question about the capacity of current decentralized blockchains like Bitcoin and Ethereum to deal with the sheer volume of transactions as they are at the moment. That's an excellent point, because Bitcoin can handle, for example, on the main blockchain, can handle only, you could count on your fingers the number of transactions per second that Bitcoin can do, compared with, say, Visa, which is thousands and thousands. But those challenges are being overcome with technical development, like different solutions on different other blockchains and data structures which hook into the main chain. Ethereum is being rewritten and re-released. There are lots of risks there, but there are also what's called second layer solutions developing with Ethereum. So obviously for using these, there are challenges of scale. But I think one of the challenges is in people's minds. As we've talked about a lot, we tend to think of payments as being something that are transacted in national currencies and done via banks. However, I have this hunch that once people start using national digital currencies and company currencies like Facebook's currency, assuming it ever launches, or Walmart have applied for a patent for their own currency, which presumably will be used in Walmart stores and for reward schemes and things like that. Once the barriers are broken down and money just becomes something that is part of, we talk about the internet of value, and it just becomes part of our daily lives, that these units of value are moved through time and space, then people's fear of the unknown with decentralized currencies like Bitcoin and Ethereum will presumably decrease as well. As far as the mainstream thing goes, we have absolutely it's been absolutely turned on its head when you think about banks and legacy companies. For example, the US listed company MicroStrategy, that announced very publicly last month that it was putting a certain amount of its corporate holdings into Bitcoin because the board believed that it would be safer there than in other assets. That's a huge thing, as was this announcement by the US regulators that banks are now allowed to apply for licenses to hold people's Bitcoin and other crypto assets for them. That is so mainstream that if we'd looked back 5 years, even 2 years, that is absolutely unthinkable. And you can also look at somewhere like Switzerland, where you can buy Bitcoin with your railway ticket at a railway station ticket machine, and even pay your taxes in some Swiss cantons with Bitcoin. It's there's that really great quote by the science fiction writer William Gibson about the future already being here, just unevenly distributed. I'm sure you've used it yourself in different contexts, but in the case of Bitcoin, that's really true. There are countries and places where it is already mainstream. It's just not mainstream everywhere yet.
Very good point. What's your take on regulation of the entire industry, the role of regulators? How well do you think the industry is regulated at the moment? Should it even be regulated? What's your take on all of this?
It's such a difficult question. I think for products built on currencies like Bitcoin to go mainstream, people are going to expect to see a certain degree of regulation. And in general, I think the UK regulator has been, which is obviously, I'm based in the UK, that's the one I'm most familiar with. I take an interest in what's happening in the rest of the world. The UK regulators have been quite interesting. They have this thing called the sandbox. The Financial Conduct Authority has this sandbox where startups can operate under a special kind of license for a limited period, in order to test things like how regulation will work and how people will react to things. And it's great because I think governments have to really tread a fine line between protecting people's interests and also stifling innovation altogether. And we saw that happen a lot in America with a few years ago, New York State introduced quite hefty regulation called the BIT license, which stifled a lot of the Bitcoin innovation happening in New York, and it went elsewhere in America to states that had a more friendly regulatory regime. There's part of me that thinks people should be able to make their own financial decisions and protect themselves by educating themselves rather than having regulation forced upon them and being told you're not sensible enough or knowledgeable enough to make these decisions for yourself, which I think that's been one of the things that has sparked a lot of the interest in decentralized finance in countries like, for example, America, where to be an accredited investor, you need to be already quite rich in order to participate in these. And it's fed this perception that the best returns are only available to people who've already got money, which obviously people see as a very, very unfair thing, and regulation as not so much protecting ordinary people, but ring fencing the wealth of a few very already wealthy people. So I think you've got to be quite careful about how regulation is perceived. But certainly for products to become mainstream, for banks and traditional financial companies to be able to transact using digital currencies and use products based on digital currencies, there has to be a degree of regulation for people who prefer to do their transacting through something like a bank or a recognized financial institution. I think it depends which country you talk about. Some are doing a better job than others. A lot of people that you talk to in Britain quite happy with the attitude of the regulators here. Certainly the ECB has shown a real willingness to engage with digital currencies, although their approach could end up ultimately stifling innovation because it looks like it could be fairly strict. It's a really interesting topic.
Yeah, they're all topics we could talk about for a whole session, I guess. The blockchain is obviously the technology that underpins Bitcoin, underpins Ethereum, underpins tokens, and so on. But there is a lot of excitement around blockchain beyond just the cryptocurrency world. Have you got any favorite examples of how blockchain can be used to transform other sectors and used in other ways other than finance?
Okay, so I was going to start talking about different interbank schemes, but you said other than finance, so I'll take that as a challenge, and we'll talk about the shipping industry. Often when people talk about blockchain technology, they're using it as a synonym for distributed ledger technology, or DLT, which is what we often tend to call these blockchain type networks that are run between companies and organizations. So the example I'm going to talk about is not running on Bitcoin or Ethereum. It's running on a different type of distributed ledger network. So I think the shipping industry is a great example because blockchains are all about trust and providing a data structure that different people and different organizations can trust even without knowing each other. And if you think about goods moving around the world, well, you have all these different issues with trust. You have company A selling to company B, and one's in country C and one's in country D. So you have maybe both the companies don't necessarily trust each other. Is the product going to be what I paid for? Is it going to be the number of units I paid for, the quality I paid for? Is it counterfeit? You have that level of trust. You have, if it's refrigerated, has it been kept at the right temperature during its journey? And then you have the countries wanting to know, is this company within my territory shipping something it's allowed to export, the country at the receiving end, is this something that the company that's bought it should be paying taxes and duties on? And then you've got an even higher level where maybe country C doesn't trust country D. Maybe there are sanctions on one of the countries and the imports are just not allowed. So at the moment, you have these container ships that go around the world. And somebody told me once that each of those ships can generate 2 kilograms of paperwork by the time you've had people signing off copies of bills of lading, contracts between companies, customs and excise paperwork. And obviously, all these people are tied up in generating this paperwork and getting it signed off and validating it and sending it to the government authorities for them to keep in their central records. Now, if it all operated in one data structure that everybody could see, you can just see instantly, no paperwork, nobody having to send copies of this, sign this, and everybody can see it and everybody can trust it. So this has actually moved beyond this might happen. And there are shipments going around the world now as we speak, where the transactions of what was packed when and what's going where are recorded on distributed ledgers. And I think that it's a really nice visual way to understand why these trust networks that blockchains and distributed ledgers give us are so important.
Yeah, fascinating. And I had a live stream with DHL and Oracle last week, and we talked about the challenge around the supply chain of the COVID-19 vaccine. Should we get this at some point? And actually, one of the big challenges and problems is that we haven't got this data network, and we haven't really got global traceability. So this is hopefully a great use case to develop this very quickly.
Yes, I mean that's a real case in point, isn't it? Everybody, something as important as that, people have to trust. So medications and so on, there are different solutions being suggested, but it's probably worth mentioning that while people talk about blockchains as being something that can solve a whole load of problems, in lots of cases they actually can't, and another technical solution might be better. I think there has been quite a lot of hype, but we've got to be careful to separate the cases where this technology is genuinely useful and solves a real problem from the many instances where it could create more problems than it might actually solve. So it's very important to urge caution as well. You know, it's a type of technology, it's not magic.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. And I think the key is that people actually understand the technology, that they read your book, that they follow people like us who write about this kind of stuff to really understand what this technology can do, when it can be used, when it shouldn't be used, what the real challenges are. And definitely no one should ever invest in anything that they don't understand.
Yes, I'm glad you said that. I was going to try to shoehorn that in. Really important for people to understand that.
Absolutely. So what do you see in the future? What are your predictions, your hopes for the digital currency space?
I would hope that while I'm all in favor of all types of providers being able to create digital wallets that will allow people to be able to take part in the digital world, not be excluded. All these things are very important, that it is not entirely dominated in the future by government currencies and large corporations. I feel that people should have a choice of how they choose to pay for things. And I would like to think of a future where everybody has some engagement with the world of the future, but doesn't have to give up all their privacy in order to transact. And I'd also like to think of a future where people maybe think very curiously about the nature of money and what it is, and empower themselves in that way.
Very good. What a great way to end this live stream. Thank you so much, Rihann. Anyone who wants to learn more about cryptocurrency, have a look at Riann's new book, The Cryptocurrency Revolution, which I really enjoyed. Thank you very much for sending me an advanced copy of it. As I said, with these conversations, I have regular conversations with super exciting people, and you can always re-watch them on my YouTube channel, or you can listen to them in your own time on my podcast. So if you ever want to re-listen or see some of the others, head to my YouTube channel or my podcast. Thank you very much, Rihann. And
thank you so much for inviting me on.
It was absolutely fascinating, and we need to, there are so many other topics and so many other questions people ask that we need to get you on again to cover them. So thank you very much.
Thanks to everyone for watching. Thanks.